deafblindness, ensuring deafblindness is seen and heard, a social work contribution, and has been put together by Peter Simcock from Birmingham City University. Just to let you all know that this session has been recorded and it will be able to be used as a resource afterwards. If people could please put themselves on mute and turn the cameras off, and throughout the session you'll be able to put questions that you have for Peter in the comment section. I'd also like to just say at this stage, a big apology. We had actually planned to have some BSL interpreters as part of this session. Unfortunately, we've been let down at the last minute, and for this kind of session, we would always like to do that, but unfortunately, they have let us down. So that's unfortunate, really. However, just to let people know, if you aren't aware, that if you use the three dots at the top of the screen and click down onto more actions, you can click on turn on live captions, which is towards the bottom of that list, just so you can do that if they need to. Just like to give you a little bit of background about the teaching partnership, and I'll be very quick so Peter can make a start with the session. So the West Midlands Teaching Partnership is one of 23 accredited teaching partnerships throughout the country, and we're made up of 28 partners, which include HEIs or universities, local authorities, NHS trusts and children's trusts. The aim of the partnership really is to bring together practitioners, senior practitioners, academics, researchers, experts by experience to support us in our work in improving social work, education and practice. And a big part of that is around CPD opportunities, hence why this practice week has been put on. So I really hope you enjoy today's session, and if you booked on any other sessions this week, then I hope you enjoy them as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. You're happy for me to make a start?
Yep, absolutely. And then just to say at the end, sorry, at the end I'll come back on just to close the session down as well and let people know about how they can give feedback.
Brilliant.
Thanks, Peter,
Thank you very much. So good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I'm very grateful to the West Midlands Social Work Teaching Partnership for inviting me to speak as part of the practice week. This week clearly has a range of interesting, informative sessions, and I hope this morning's will be equally of interest to you. It's good to see people interested in a topic. It is a topic that I am very passionate about and take every opportunity I can to bang on about it, as many of you will know. So I'm going to share my screen now for the slides, and we'll go through those. So bear with me a second. Okay, can somebody just confirm to me that they can see the slides?
Hi, we can see them.
Perfect, thank you very much, that's great. Okay, so ensuring deafblindness is seen and heard, the social work contribution. Now, I could say a little bit about myself. I'm senior lecturer in social work based at Birmingham City University, worked at another university before that, and before that I was in social work practice. But I think far more interesting than hearing about me and my background is a little bit about why am I so passionate about deafblindness. I think it's always interesting, isn't it, to find out why do people choose what they choose? Why do they go in that area of practice? Why does that float their boat, as it were? Why do they research what they research? And I can really pinpoint how my interest in deafblindness all started, because it started in 1997. I was learning British Sign Language, and somebody came to speak to us from the Voluntary Service for the Blind and said, oh, we need some volunteers. Our Deafblind Club, would anybody come and help out? And I was quite intrigued by this Deafblind Club. What's that? Helen Keller, I think we did her at school. I'll go along and see what's happening. Now, I remember going along. I can't remember doing a DBS check or anything, but I'm sure I must have done, but who knows? Perhaps they just let me rock up. And turned up and they said, oh, great that you're here. Please, can you help this person? I'll call her Barbara, not her real name. Please, can you help Barbara with the bingo? And I sat next to this woman. She was profoundly deafblind, the first deafblind person I'd ever met in my life. And she obviously felt my presence next to her, and she put out her hand to receive tactile communication, touch-based communication. So at that stage, my deafblind manual skills were very rudimentary, as it were, but we muddled through a game of bingo and we had a little conversation. And I was absolutely bowled over by the whole experience. And it was at that point I thought, that's it. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to become a social worker working with deafblind people. And that's what I did. I've since left practice. I was in practice for around 10 years, working with deaf and deafblind people, and then moved into education. But my interest in deafblindness has remained, and I continue to teach on this and research on this. And my doctoral studies focused on deafblindness as well. But what do we know about deafblindness itself? Well, not that much really, although the field is growing. And if we think about what we know already, this largely starts by thinking about the provenance of campaigning organisations. Now, the provenance of campaigning organisations is often found in a shared concern about the needs, particularly the educational needs of deafblind children. If we think about organisations like Deafblind International, started in the 1950s, very much focused on deafblind children and their education. And similarly, it's interesting, isn't it? We're in the middle of a pandemic, and since we had the rubella pandemic, and so children born in the sort of 1950s with congenital rubella syndrome, and mothers had got together, how can we support our deafblind children? And ultimately their work led to the foundation of SENSE, the organisation, the national and international organisation Charity SENSE, but concerned about children and deafblind children and their education. And it wasn't really until the 1980s, in a very explicit way, that organisations became interested in other groups of deafblind people, deafblind adults and older people who acquire deafblindness in later life. And the research community has very much mirrored this. The research community is very much focused on children, deafblind children and their education, and only from the 1980s onwards sort of explicitly looking at the experiences of others. What we do know about deafblindness is complicated by the methodological challenges of completing research in this area. Some researchers actually thinking it's just too complicated to involve deafblind people in studies. But we are getting there. But as Jesper Dameyer comments, deafblindness, research on deafblindness is in its infancy, and we're still developing. Particular gaps in knowledge are around qualitative inquiry. What do we know about the experiences of deafblind people themselves and the realities of their lives? We know very little about those that are born deafblind, or perhaps deafblind in early childhood, about their lives now they've got older. So people don't stay as children, of course. What is it like to live with and age with the impairment? And we know very little about those living in low and middle income countries. What we do know is that whilst deafblindness is what we would call a minority impairment, researchers agree, there's consensus amongst researchers, that the prevalence of deafblindness increases with age. And we are, of course, an ageing population. So we know that the numbers of deafblind people in our community is going to grow, partly as a result of being an ageing population, and partly, of course, as a result of medical advances, such that children born with certain conditions survive those conditions and go on to lead their lives. But what we also know from Helen Louie, writing back in the 90s, is the way in which deafblindness has been marginalised by the profession somewhat, the social work profession. And she wrote back in the 90s, any social worker knows that difficulties in communication, independent functioning and self-esteem are psychosocial issues. And I would add there issues around relationships and issues around loss. These are very central, aren't they, in social work? They're not particularly niche or unusual. And we know that deafblindness creates or contributes to all of these problems, all of these difficulties. In fact, these psychosocial elements are often more significant than the clinical ophthalmic and audio issues associated with deafblindness. So we know these are psychosocial issues, and yet our profession of social work has been curiously inactive in the field. Very few social workers specialise in the field, and generalists, even those in ageing, tend to give the issue less attention than it deserves. Now, Louis was writing in the 90s, but it seems it's somewhat still the case, doesn't it? I'm often told that I'm too niche. It's a very niche topic. Why would I want to focus solely on this? And Deafblind Awareness Month comes and goes with little to no comment from the British Association of Social Work, from Social Work England. We get the talking head videos, don't we, during Mental Health Week, for example. I'm not criticising that, of course, but we don't see the same in deafblindness. In fact, it's barely mentioned at all. And yet, I believe very strongly that the social work profession has a lot to offer, social work and indeed social care. And that's really what I want to talk about today. Now, we only have an hour and a half, and those that have heard me speak before know that I do go on and on and on and on and on. So I don't think we'll be able to cover everything today, and the chances are that we can only scratch the surface. But I do hope that this will be an interesting overview of how I think social work can and does contribute to the lives of deafblind people. And I've summarised that really in 6 ways. Social work can recognise and identify deafblindness. It can acknowledge its impact. It can offer legal literacy, something we know as a strength, particularly in a multidisciplinary team. It's often the social worker that brings the legal literacy. It's about being creative, about mixing support, both traditional and specialist, and of course, referring on and working collaboratively. And again, we know, don't we, that a strength and a skill of social work is the ability to network, work collaboratively, and bring teams together. So I want to think about each of these areas in turn. Recognise and identify. Going back to those comments of Helen Louis in the 1990s, she added that social workers can help simply by appreciating the significance of deafblindness. And I think this is particularly important when we think about older people with late life acquired deafblindness. What we do know is that deafblindness is the great unseen and unrecognised disability. It can't be visible. It's not visible. It's an invisible impairment, isn't it? But it's not always recognised. It was quite interesting when people ask me what I did or what I do, and I say I work with deafblind people. Often I would get the response, oh, you work with deaf people and blind people. Well, no, I work with people who are deafblind. I do remember one woman was quite indignant and said, well, you can't possibly be both. So she completely denied its existence. I'm not sure why she was quite so indignant. But it is quite a complex impairment, and deafblind people have been described as some of the most disabled by the norms of our society. Deafblind people have also been considered as the most vulnerable, although that is subject to challenge. They didn't get mentioned in UK legislation until the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act 1990. Now, we know, of course, that act is no longer relevant insofar as it relates to adults, but is still of importance to disabled children, of course. And it wasn't until 2001 that we actually see some policy guidance around deafblindness. So there is a real lack of recognition. And if we take that beyond the UK and focus on a more global scale, the World Federation of the Deafblind produced the first ever global report on the rights of persons with disabilities back in 2018. And from the data that we have available, only 37% of countries recognise deafblindness as a distinct disability. And the result of this lack of recognition is the invisibility of deafblind people in statistics, in policy, and in welfare programs and services, and ultimately, of course, their exclusion from such provision. Now, it's important to note that since this report was produced, that figure will slightly have changed, because in October 2020, the lower house of Congress, the Parliament in Chile, approved a bill that recognised deafblindness as a unique disability. And so this desire to get the impairment recognised as a unique disability is still one of the key aims and missions, if you like, of charitable organisations and campaigning organisations of and for deafblind people to get the condition recognised as a distinct disability. And we can see from those figures, congratulations to Chile, but there's still a way to go in getting it recognised. So when we think about how do we recognise it and identify it ourselves, I think it's important to think about the words from Donna Sauerberger here, that as hearing sighted people, we can never know what it is like to be both deaf and blind, unless, of course, we are. I believe it is both more awesome and less awesome than we imagine. And I think this is really important. This more awesome and less awesome than we imagine that Sauerberger refers to. Now, Sauerberger is a rehabilitation officer working in the States with a long history of working with deafblind people. Why do I think this is so important? While we know there's evidence of loss of control, social isolation, loneliness amongst deafblind people, there is also research evidence that suggests very differing experiences, with some deafblind people experiencing low levels of social isolation. And I think part of our recognition as social workers, particularly we know all the conversations now about strengths-based work and asset-based work, etc., is that we don't underestimate the potentiality of deafblind people or make assumptions, thinking here about sort of tragedy models of disability, that in some way to be deafblind is unequivocally tragic. And I think capturing that beautifully are the words of Amber Davis, who is a deafblind young adult, and she wrote this relatively recently in a blog that she keeps. I was prompted to write this blog post by a recent tweet, so she'd come across a tweet on Twitter. The tweet said, "The fact that deafblindness exists makes my head and heart hurt. You can't see or you can't hear. What kind of life is that?" Her assumption that without sight and sound, life is inevitably bad is so wrong. I run my own business. I have a degree from a top university, and I am a member of both a tandem cycling club and a walking group. I have just taken on a small allotment. What sort of life is that? A pretty good one, as far as I'm concerned. Thank you very much. So I think there's a real indicator there that we must not underestimate the potentiality of deafblind people and the contribution they make and can and do make to the society in which we live. But if we're thinking about who deafblind people are, if our role as social workers is to be able to recognise and identify the impairment, we might be drawn to names such as these. This is famous people who've become part of deafblind history, if you like, and their lives are captured in books, in films, and we're taught about them at school. Laura Bridgman, for example, born in 1829, known as the first deafblind person to be successfully educated in the English language. Now, when Laura was an older adult, she met a child and that child was Helen Keller. Helen Keller, born in 1880. And some of you may be more familiar with this name. Certainly, when I was at school, we learned about Helen Keller. Helen Keller became deafblind when she was around 18 months old, owing to illness. She was the first deafblind person to earn a bachelor's degree. And her life certainly has been immortalised in films such as The Miracle Worker. A more sort of a fictional account, which isn't about Helen Keller, but clearly has been influenced by her life, is the Bollywood film Black, starring Rani Mukherjee, who plays a deafblind woman securing an education. So both of those films, if you want to have a watch of those, I would recommend them. Helen Keller, what's less known about her is that she was an author, political activist and lecturer, and so radical, she was very much on the left of politics, and so radical were her thoughts that the FBI kept a file on her. There's really nothing not to love about Helen Keller. And Alice Betteridge is known as the Australian Helen Keller, so born in Australia and known as the first deafblind child to be educated there. But I think it's very important that we're mindful that these people are not representative of the majority deafblind population. Indeed, the majority are not like these people. These people have lived extraordinary lives. And perhaps to modernise it, here are some other deafblind people who you may or may not be familiar with. Haben Girma there in the right, you may have seen her biography, which has come out recently, the first deafblind person to be educated at Harvard and graduate from Harvard Law School, and is now a lawyer, speaker and author, particularly focused on disability rights and human rights. Molly Watt, based in the UK, deafblind woman who is inspirational speaker and has spoken across the country from Harvard University to Staffordshire University a few years ago. And I'm just picking some here. Alexandra Adams, medical student, deafblind, one of the first deafblind medical students, again in the UK. But again, these people aren't necessarily representative of the entire deafblind population. And so as a little test now, we can think, how skilled are you at identifying whether people are deafblind or not? So I'm going to go through some case studies now. And all I want you to do is think, is this person deafblind or not? That's all I want you to think about. So we'll start with Aisha. Aisha was born with congenital rubella syndrome. She has very little hearing, although it has been difficult to assess. She has reduced vision, only being able to see about 3 foot ahead of herself. Aisha cannot mobilize without support, and communication is established through hearing aids, large pictures, and touch. Would you consider Aisha to be deafblind? Matt is 28 years old. He was born profoundly deaf and uses British Sign Language. In his teens, he developed retinitis pigmentosa, a sight condition, which has affected his night vision and reduced his visual field. He can still access BSL if it's directly in front of him, and he can read text messages, SMS messages, on a mobile phone. But he doesn't go out alone in the evening when it's dark, as he has difficulty mobilizing safely. Is Matt deafblind? Atul is 35. He has autism and learning disabilities. He has difficulties with speech and prefers to use Makaton. He lost an eye as a result of an accident in childhood and needs to scan when mobilizing and when accessing Makaton. Is Atul deafblind? Dalton is 68. He was born with a moderate hearing loss and in his early 20s developed RP, retinitis pigmentosa. His vision deteriorated to the point that he was registered severely sight impaired, or in old language blind, when he was in his 40s. Dalton uses speech and 2 hearing aids to communicate, although he struggles in groups and noisy environments. He uses audio to access permanent information. Dalton mobilizes with a long cane or with a sighted guide. Is Dalton deafblind? And last but by no means least is Dora. Dora is 97 years old. Her vision has been affected by both macular degeneration and cataracts. She can access large print with magnification. She describes herself as very hard of hearing and wears 2 hearing aids. She needs to be in a quiet room to hear clear speech. So that's all of our characters. Are they deafblind? Well, I'm afraid there's no prizes for anybody getting them all right, apart from the joy of winning. And I guess most of you have already seen the point I'm making. Apart from Atul, all of these people in social care terms are deafblind. So well done if you got those right. The only one that wouldn't be considered deafblind is Atul. And you can probably see here that the point I'm making is that people do not need to be profoundly deaf and totally blind in order to be considered deafblind. So what does it actually mean, the term deafblind? Well, it's actually very complex to define, to describe, and therefore to identify, as Jesper Damer pointed out. And at the moment, Walter Wittig and colleagues are doing a huge systematic review, drawing on the International Classification of Functioning from the World Health Organization to help us define what is meant by deafblindness. Perhaps the term itself is misleading. some people do seem to think that deafblind means profoundly deaf and totally blind. But that level of impairment is actually incredibly rare. And if I think about my own experience, having worked with deafblind people for many years now, I can think of only 2 people that I've ever met that were profoundly deaf and totally blind. Most deafblind people have some residual hearing and or vision. If we're thinking particularly about older people, a few use the term to describe themselves. For example, people may say, yeah, particularly those involved in the deaf community, I am deaf with visual impairment, or I'm deaf but I have some sight loss. They may describe themselves as having vision and hearing difficulties. Perhaps more common language would be, I have to have the TV on very loud and my daughter reads my post to me, rather than I am deafblind. We also know that a range of definitions exist. For example, in the US, there is a legal definition that draws on both clinical measures and functional difficulties. The Nordic definition, that deriving from the 5 Nordic countries, is a very functional definition. But what about us here in the UK and specifically in England? Well, for our purposes, in social work and social care, then the definition is found from the Department of Health. Now, this definition emerged from the work of the Deafblind Services Liaison Group back in the 80s, but it was adopted by the Department of Health in 1997 and is now the definition contained in Care Act regulations and Care Act guidance. And you can see that the definition here is completely functional. People are regarded as deafblind if their sight and hearing impairment causes difficulties with 3 things: communication, access to information, and mobility. You can see that in this definition, there is no reference to registration status. There is no reference to any kind of clinical measures that the sight loss has to be at a certain level, or that the hearing loss has to be at a certain level. There's no reference to those sorts of measures. Simply, it is focused on the functional difficulties associated with combined sight and hearing loss. This definition therefore includes those with a progressive sight and hearing loss. So why is this so important? Why am I going on about this definition so much? Well, this is very much linked with the notion of deafblindness as a unique impairment. You'll remember early on I talked about getting it recognised as a unique impairment, as a third separate sensory impairment, separate to deafness and blindness. And I think the best way to think about this, some have used the term 1 + 1 = 3, or this idea of synergy, the sum is greater than the parts. But I think a more colourful and helpful analogy is given by a deafblind woman herself that Ali refers to. And that woman said this: if you imagine that deafness is yellow and that blindness is blue, if you put them together, you don't get yellow-blue, you get green, a third entity. And the defining feature of that entity is synergy. An impairment, in one sense, affects the ability to compensate for impairment in the other. And this is why, as social workers, it's very important that we avoid assessing the 2 impairments separately. Let me give you an example. If I have a significant hearing impairment, a severe to profound loss, and I rely on lip reading in order to communicate, even a minor sight impairment, when combined with that, is going to impact on me significantly. But if I looked at the visual impairment alone, I might overlook it thinking, but it's not that significant. They're not registered blind. But it is in combination, it is the synergy that is creating difficulties. If I'm a visually impaired person who relies very much on my hearing to navigate safely outside, even a relatively minor hearing impairment, when taken alone, could actually be far more significant to me if I already have visual impairment. We're looking at this idea of synergy. One impacts on the other it prevents the single sensory impaired person, the dual sensory impaired person, I beg your pardon, from being able to use one sense to compensate for impairment in the other. Now, the evidence base is a little bit mixed in relation as to whether the effect is additive or multiplied in that sense. Although Saunders and Echt back in 2012 did draw on a range of evidence to identify there was certainly emerging evidence of this kind of larger functional effect when the two impairments are combined. What this means is that the number of people that can be considered deafblind is rather a large group, and although it's a minority impairment, they're a minority with a high level of variety. And this matrix that was presented at the Canadian Deafblind Conference quite some years ago now and developed by Ruth Coppersmith, I think can be very helpful in thinking about who may be considered deafblind. So you can see it used the rather unhelpful language of normal vision and normal hearing, but you can see the point that is being made here, that if we look across this matrix, all those people in that green block could be considered deafblind. Now, as I said, although it's a minority impairment, it is a very heterogeneous population, a very mixed population, and all of these variables can impact on the way that the impairment is experienced by different deafblind people. For example, the age of the person, the age of onset, when did they become deafblind, the interval between impairment in each sense. Did they were they born deafblind? Were they born deaf and the sight loss came many years later, or were they very close together? What language does the person use and communication method do they use? Were they a deaf person using sign language and now their vision has started to deteriorate? Were they a hard of hearing person or somebody with a moderate hearing loss but using speech and aids and now their vision has started to deteriorate, for example? And what is their cultural background? Are they culturally deaf? Do they engage with the deaf community? And is that how they identify? And of course, any additional disabilities or impairments, learning disability, cognitive impairment, will also impact on the experience of deafblindness. To help us sort of manage this, many have split deafblindness into two: congenital deafblindness and acquired deafblindness. So congenital deafblindness, those who are where the deafblindness is present at birth, perhaps through genetic disorders or any difficulties during pregnancy, or was it acquired? Did the deafblindness come after the person has developed language? And there are very important distinctions between these two. As you can imagine, the congenitally deafblind child is going to have difficulties not only with communication, but with the very notion of language. What does that mean? Often, though not always, people with congenital deafblindness may have additional difficulties, including learning disability, for example, though not always. Acquired, people with acquired deafblindness may have their other challenges. So, for example, a lifetime spent in the hearing sighted world, there's going to be a lot of adaptation and change. But really, this sort of simple binary between congenital and acquired is inadequate in describing the variety of deafblind people. There are congenital conditions that result in acquired deafblindness. Those that acquire deafblindness before they have developed language are possibly more akin to congenital. And so it's a bit simplistic, and many people have worked on developing this binary further. Part of that work we see in social care policy from the Department of Health, as it was then, now the Department of Health and Social Care, of course, and splitting deafblind people into 5 groups. So in that red block there, you've got deafblind people from birth or early childhood. And then in all the others, the orange, yellow, green and pink boxes there are groups of people who have acquired the impairment. But I think you can see across these 5 groups, these people are very different. Their experiences of deafblindness will be very different. And therefore, our response as a social worker will be and it needs to be very different. You can perhaps see how some of the characters from the earlier discussion would relate to each of those boxes. Just a brief comment on how many deafblind people there are. Very difficult to determine because of these definitional difficulties, and often many of the tools that we use, so for example, census information, that sort of thing, again, it doesn't recognize deafblindness, so it lists the sensory impairments separately, and those wishing to gather the data would have to cross-reference everything. However, the overall consensus, as I've said, is that prevalence increases with age. Dual sensory loss is common in later life, not inevitable, but common. If we look at the World Federation of Deafblindness in their report, they estimate 0.2% of the population are living with severe deafblindness, 2% with milder forms. But if we focus more closely on the UK, the prevalence rate is suggested, this is from the work of Robertson and Emerson, around 572 people per 100k, so 356,000 in the UK deafblind people. Now people are estimating 400,000 deafblind people, so a growing population. And as I've said already, the ageing population and advances in medical intervention contribute to that. So I hope that's given a bit of an overview in terms of definition as to identifying deafblind people and who would be considered for social care purposes, certainly, as deafblind. And I'll come back to that when we talk about legal literacy. As Helen Louis said, acknowledging its impact is really important. And I think this is especially the case for those of you working with older people, because often sensory impairment, particularly dual sensory impairment, is seen erroneously as simply part of getting older by care workers, by family, by older people themselves, as if it's some kind of benign consequence of getting older, and therefore it's overlooked and nothing is done about it. Liz Duncan talks about an almost institutional reluctance to refer people on for specialist support, particularly older people, when it is simply passed off as your hearing and vision are affected. That's part of getting old. Deafblindness may also be overshadowed or overlooked in learning disability, and many of you working in that field will know the phenomenon where learning disability almost masks other difficulties and everything is attributed to learning disability, which again is problematic. What we know is the psychosocial impact of deafblindness can be significant, an impact on communication difficulties and social isolation. Despite reference to sensory impairments being static, this is a bit of a myth, I think. Many would experience ongoing change and therefore the need for adaptation. And we see this particularly in people aging with deafblindness, perhaps somebody that has spent a lifetime accessing permanent information through Braille, but a result of other conditions, the sensitivity in their fingers is now affected such that Braille is no longer accessible. As hearing and vision fluctuates, so too may their communication needs, and they need to adapt again and again and again. And people, particularly with conditions like Usher syndrome, describe an almost daily need to adapt to changes in their hearing and vision. We know that deafblindness can have an impact on activities of daily living and instrumental activities of daily living and functional independence, an impact on quality of life, including health, but also not just physical health, but emotional, psychological and mental health problems. Now, again, although there's a little bit of a mixed picture in the research, there is some evidence of higher levels of emotional, psychological and mental health problems in the deaf-blind community compared with their hearing-sighted peers. But of course, as all social workers know, conditions can often impact on people beyond the person themselves, but also partners, families, and some work has been done recently about the impact on deafblind parents, and some work on the impact on deafblindness on the sexual lives of couples where one partner is deafblind. And I think it would be remiss of me not to note how deafblind people have been disproportionately affected during the COVID-19 pandemic. We heard, didn't we, all this reference to social distancing, and the World Health Organization then suggesting, no, we need to abandon this idea of social distancing. It's physical distancing that we need, because people, in terms of their mental health, actually need to be socially connected during this difficult time. Well, that's not so easily done for deafblind people, for whom the physical and the social are not so easily separated. When my communication requires physical contact, when my ability to move around, my mobility, requires me to hold on to somebody else, it's not quite so easy to separate the physical and the social. And I certainly have heard stories of the police accosting a deafblind man who is being supported by a sighted guide, saying, "You're breaking the rules of the lockdown." We know, don't we, that access to information, public health information about coronavirus has not always been accessible to deafblind people. We know legal action is being taken against our own government for the repeated failure to provide live BSL interpreting at the daily briefings. And yet tactile British Sign Language isn't even mentioned in the debate, of course. And so deafblind people have struggled possibly with distancing regulations. When the lift opens, how do I know if anybody's in there or not? How do I know if I'm keeping 2 meters apart from somebody at all times? I don't know. I'm not able to navigate those sorts of systems. And of course, I think it goes without saying that increased use of PPE has resulted in significant communication difficulties for deaf and deafblind people, as the face is covered by a mask, rendering lip reading impossible. And of course, deafblind people have reported concerns with the very tactile nature of their lives. I'm signing during the day, I'm touching my own face, I'm holding onto my long cane, I'm holding onto somebody else. And so there are many difficulties, and not all of these have been considered by governments across the globe, really, such that deafblind people have felt very much overlooked during the pandemic and the policy responses that we've seen to it. So one of those difficulties, you'll remember 3 difficulties that are central to the definition of deafblindness: difficulties with communication, access to information, and mobility. And I'm going to focus on the first of those, communication. We don't have time to think about all 3. But we know, don't we, as social workers, that communication really is at the heart of being human, being able to communicate our thoughts, our ideas, our wishes, our feelings, etc., etc. And of course, deafblindness can have a significant impact on the way in which we actually communicate, but it's beyond that. The implications are beyond simply the difficulties communicating. It can make communication very time consuming if I'm having to spell things out tactually or write things down. And as a result, communication can become very superficial. We hear stories of deafblind people saying, I was at the meeting about my social care and all the professionals and family talked about it, and then I got a summary at the end. It's not really appropriate, is it? I know if it was my life, I would want to be central to those discussions, not the afterthought with the brief summary at the end. And yet communication becomes superficial. A participant in my own study talks about his experiences at the Deaf Club. People come along, they say, hello, how are you? But then they want to go. They want to go and talk to somebody else because it's too time consuming with me. Of course, we have to think about people's ability and willingness to learn new methods. I've mentioned already that people need to adapt. And if people got the ability and the skills to learn new methods, we must not, of course, underestimate people's ability to learn new methods. Sometimes we just have to find out what's the best way of communicating with somebody. And of course, a shortage of interpreters. We've really seen that this morning, haven't we? Because we've been let down with British Sign Language interpreters and their availability for this session. But imagine if you're deafblind and you need a qualified interpreter that has the required skills to work with you. And so stories of huge delays in people accessing health and social care services with an appropriate interpreter, or being in situations where there wasn't appropriate interpretation. But again, if we think more widely about the implications of this impact on communication, Of course, it's going to contribute to increased social isolation and a loss of independence and control over one's life, reduced involvement in decision making. Again, those of you in social work will be very familiar with the principles of the Mental Capacity Act, and I'm thinking here about Principle 2, all practicable steps to help someone make a decision. We need to think about how am I ensuring that this deafblind person is able to be involved, and we shouldn't be making assumptions that they lack capacity to make particular decisions. And of course, we know from the literature that there are experiences of deafblind people being misdiagnosed with mental health problems and therefore receiving inappropriate treatment. Now, I'm often asked, how do deafblind people communicate? How do I communicate then with a deafblind person? And we've seen the huge variety in the deafblind population. And as somebody once said to me many years ago when I was doing some of my own training, there are as many ways of communicating with deafblind people as there are deafblind people. And I think that's true. And there may well be variation in the way somebody communicates expressively rather than receptively. So I may use one method to receive communication, but I express myself in a different way. My communication may vary depending on my environment. I can use my residual hearing, for example, when I'm in my front room with the TV off with no sound, but I can't use my residual hearing when I'm in the shopping centre outdoors and it's a noisy environment or it's a group environment. I have to change there. So somebody's communication method or language isn't necessarily fixed. But if we want to think about some of what the approaches are, I've listed just a few here. Of course, we may be making use of residual hearing and or vision, clear speech, lip reading, people using hearing aids, for example. And it's very important as part of our assessments. We're talking about what residual hearing and vision people have and how we can make best use of it. For those that are familiar with British Sign Language, but their vision has started to deteriorate, we may use visual frame signing. I don't know if you can see in the picture there, but effectively the signer imagines a frame, and the frame is the vision that the person has. So they might not be able to see beyond the frame. Their visual field has been restricted. And so I keep my signing within that frame. I don't go beyond that. Tadoma is something of a more rare approach to communication, and although I've seen it used, I've never worked with somebody myself that uses Tadoma. Now, this emerged during the 1920s, sort of the height of oralism, when attempts were made to suppress sign language, and oralism was seen as key, and therefore the deaf children were being the focus was very much on lip reading, but for deafblind people they therefore focused on tactile lip reading. And this approach is named after two students who were taught the method back in the 1920s, two children, one called Tad Chapman and one called Omer Simpson. Tad Omer, you can see where that's come from. Omer Simpson, not Homer Simpson, who I assure you is someone quite different. So these two children were taught this method, and yeah, again, I don't know if you can see from the picture, but the deafblind gentleman there is lip reading the speaker, but his vision is such he can't see the lips, and so the thumb is placed on the lips to feel the movement of the lips, the fingers on the jawline to feel the movement of the jaw, and the final fingers on the throat to feel the vibrations of the vocal cords. And so that combination enables the deafblind person to lip read. Now, for those where these use of residual hearing and or vision are possible, or environments where that's not possible, we may need to explore touch-based or tactile language. And here's a few of those methods here: block alphabet, deafblind manual, hands-on and tactile signing, and haptic communication. So block alphabet, I can guarantee that you will all be able to do this within 5 minutes. Because you're able to write. And block alphabet is very much based on the standard alphabet. And again, you can see in the picture, but instead of using a pen and writing things down on a piece of paper, the speaker uses their finger as the pen and draws block capital letters on the hand of the deafblind person, and the letters are felt, and each word is spelt out. So each letter, one on top of the other, spelt out. Very easy to learn to do, easier to learn to receive, but as you can imagine, relatively slow, spelling every single word out. Nevertheless, this has proved very useful for those acquiring deafblindness in later life who are familiar with that language. This is a method I've introduced to people. There was one gentleman I was working with in a care home. The care home had given notice saying we can't meet his needs anymore. And when I went to see this gentleman, and unfortunately, his sight and hearing had deteriorated to a point that he couldn't hear what I was explaining to him. He couldn't tell I was trying to explain we need to explore other ways of communicating. It was too late to plan ahead. He was in this situation. And this gentleman also had a diagnosis of Alzheimer's type dementia. And so I thought, I'm just going to have to go with it for block alphabet. So I took his hand and he snatched it away. Very understandable. What are you doing to me? This is a very frightening environment. Now somebody's turned up who I don't know and they're taking my hand. But eventually he let me take his hand and I did H, and he no reaction. I persevered and eventually said H. I thought, we've got it, we're through. So I spat out hello and he responded, oh, hello, how are you? And we were able to develop that. I went on to commission somebody with him to work with him on a daily basis for a couple of months to teach him this method of communicating, to teach the staff, and the care home withdrew notice and were happy to keep him. And as part of that communication, he actually began to wash and dress himself. He no longer needed two people to mobilize, but was mobilizing with one person. And so it had a real impact on his well-being. Deafblind manual, again, is a touch-based language done on the hand of the deafblind person, but various places on the hand represent each letter of the alphabet. Words are spelt out, but it can be much quicker than block alphabet, and people can get up to quite a good speed with this one. But of course, both of those methods are effectively English-based. You're spelling out words, English words in English word order. And so for somebody who is profoundly deaf, part of the deaf community whose first and preferred language is British Sign Language, if they go on to lose their vision, something like hands-on or tactile signing is probably going to be more appropriate. And this is where the signs are no longer seen, but they are felt by the receiver. And you can see the deafblind woman there holding the hands of the signer and feeling their movement. And that's going to be more familiar to her as a way of receiving communication. Now, the last one that I've put on the list here is haptic communication. And this is relatively new system of tactile signs that are actually used to fill in the gaps that some of these communication methods don't cover. So it covers things like describing the environment, emotional responses, the descriptions of people, or additional information that is going on around us that would otherwise be provided by sight. And these signs are given through touch, commonly on the person's back. You can see the haptic communicator there is doing symbols on the deafblind person's back. It originated in Finland, this approach, although it's increasingly used elsewhere. And the signs can be used to indicate things like laughter, anger. If I'm in a group, somebody could draw on my back. This is what the room looks like. This is where people are sat. Whilst perhaps somebody is deafblind manualing to me what the person is saying, the haptic communicator may be indicating to me that somebody's just got up and left the room. If we were all in a room together and it started raining, I wouldn't need to tell you that it was raining. We would all know it. We would hear it outside. We would see it. But the deafblind person needs to be told that information. And so haptic communication enables these things to be said. I saw it used relatively recently at a conference where the speaker was deafblind, and the haptic communicator at the end of the presentation, during the presentation, the haptic communicator was able to indicate the crowd are laughing at the joke you've just made. The crowd are clapping that point. You have a question, and I will guide you as to the position of where the questioner is, so you can turn to face them. They can also convey meaning. For example, to use a silly example, if somebody were to say, would you like a coffee? If I use block alphabet or deafblind manual to convey that, it would simply be the words, would you like a coffee? And yet we would all know that through the tone of our voice, we could indicate whether we actually mean a coffee or if we mean something quite different, and we're being very flirtatious. How does the deafblind person pick up on that sort of communication? How does the person pick up on, well, the person's actually being sarcastic, or the person's making a joke and they're smiling, or they don't only agree with what you said, but they really agree with what you said and they're nodding vigorously. Yes, yes, you're absolutely right. So haptic communication can convey some of this additional information. A while ago, I was talking to a Swedish deafblind woman, and the tactile sign language interpreter was signing to her what I was saying. And there was a third person sat with us. And during the conversation, that third person got up and walked away. I didn't need to be told. I saw her get up and walk away. But the haptic communicator told the Swedish lady I was talking to, she indicated, while we're talking, that woman next to you has just got up and walked away. It didn't interrupt our conversation, but the deafblind person was kept fully informed as to what was going on. Now, what I haven't listed there is what's called objects of reference, which very much came from work with congenitally deafblind children and multisensory impaired children, where an object is used to symbolize a significant activity. So, for example, the child may be handed a towel and they feel a towel, and that means we're going swimming now, or means we're going to have a bath now. Or they're given a cup, for example, to indicate, do you want a drink, or a fork to indicate we're going to have a meal. The symbol becomes an object of reference. It refers to something that is happening. But of course, again, when we're thinking about assessment, we need to think about what method are they using now and in what environments? What method do they use expressively and what receptively? What method do they use now, but what method do they need to use in the future? If I know the prognosis is deterioration, if I know this person at the moment has enough vision for visual frame signing, but their vision is going to deteriorate, we need to be talking about tactile sign language now, in such that we're prepared for the future. And so assessment is about now, it's about the future. And of course, communication isn't one way. It's all very good teaching deafblind people these methods. We need to teach family and friends these methods, otherwise the person has no one to talk to. And what is the deafblind person going to talk about? You need something meaningful to be able to talk to other people. So you need a fuller life. And this, I think, credit to the Care Act with its emphasis on well-being, is part of that. It's not simply about being able to communicate, but having something to say. We've observed this in many interactions, particularly with deafblind children or people congenitally deafblind, that their communication is simply reduced to a series of instructions. We're going to do this now. This is what we're doing now. Now we're going to eat the meals. There was very little communication, simply everyday chat that makes for well-being in our lives. Imagine your own life if the only communication you ever had was a list of instructions. What we do know, and one thing, again, why I'm so passionate about deafblindness, is that deafblind people that I have met have taught me a considerable amount about communication and even about what it means to be human. I have learned so much from the deafblind community, and I think we all can. And what Femke Krijger, a Dutch deafblind woman, commented on in a piece she wrote back in 2011 is that the relationship between a deafblind client and a social worker is actually very, very complex. And here she makes 2 points, really. Firstly, she valued the social worker that didn't see her as deafblindness on legs, you're deafblind and that's all you're about, but actually saw her as Femke, a person who happens to be deafblind. So this was the first thing that was considered to be very important. And she encourages social workers very much to focus on strengths, not only despite her deafblindness, but because of her deafblindness, the way in which she's able to contribute to society because she is deafblind, not simply despite it. But what she also recognises is the physical contact that she has with a social worker means that the relationship becomes rather complicated. And so we know this discussion of touch and its relationship in social work is rather complicated. A bit odd to me that the idea of not touching service users would be very odd in my line of work. If I didn't touch my service users, I wouldn't be able to communicate with them or for them to know that I was there necessarily. And so there is that engagement. But what does it mean for our relationship with that person? And the example that Femke gives is when the social worker came to see her one day and was leading us through the room, and Femke said to the social worker, "What's wrong with you?" The social worker said, "There's nothing wrong with me." "Oh, but there is. I can tell. I can feel it. You're very tense. I can feel it as you're guiding me round. I can feel the tension in your hand. Something's wrong." And something was wrong. The social worker had difficulties in her own life at that time. Now, that isn't something she'd ordinarily disclose. It would be inappropriate, wouldn't it? It's not about you as a social worker, it's about the person. But she had disclosed it, albeit unintentionally, because of the nature of their relationship. And so staying on this idea of touch at a moment, we know that touch is important to all deafblind people, not just those using touch-based communication, but all deafblind people. It is something we engage with. And yet we know some deafblind people may experience tactile defensiveness, the idea that you have a negative reaction to being touched by another person or by an object or something that is in your, when it comes into contact with you, you react defensively. Again, I think the best example I can give here is, imagine I wouldn't do this, it'd be weird, but imagine I came to you with a box. You can't look in the box, but put your hand inside the box. And what you touch is odd, it feels strange. I think you would recognize that your reaction may be to quickly pull your hands out. Oh, what's that? We don't like to touch what we cannot see. And yet for the deafblind child, if we don't break down that tactile defensiveness, if we don't enable the child or support the child to be able to accept and receive touch, how are we going to communicate with them? How are they going to be able to receive treatment as necessary from visiting health and social care practitioners? But once we have broken that tactile defensiveness down, how does the deafblind child know what touch is appropriate and what touch is not appropriate? So they've learned to accept touch way beyond normative standards. The deafblind child is touched far more than the hearing sighted child, and touched by far more range of people than by the hearing sighted child. So how do they know that the touch at the day centre that they receive is actually sexual abuse? And so when we think about touch vulnerability and risk, particularly when we're thinking about deafblind children, not only is this complicated by the communication difficulties, who do I disclose this to? I have very few communication partners that are able to communicate with that I can tell. The added layer of vulnerability is, does the deafblind child even know there is anything to tell? Or is this just normal life, that this is what happens to me? And there have been instances, for example, of physical abuse where deafblind children have not disclosed anything because it was simply a physical sensation. They didn't have an understanding that it was actually abusive. And again, when we come to think about assessment, we need to think about how comfortable are we with touch as professionals, and how does that impact on our own communication and the quality of that communication with deafblind people. But if we're assessing people's current communication needs, but also their future needs, part of our assessment isn't simply, are they able to learn a new method, excuse me, but how comfortable are they with touch? Are they from a touchy-feely family or not? Are we going to need to do some more work with them around that? It's not as simple as turning up and saying, oh, well, you need to do manual, here's a card, and suddenly you know how to do it. There are also psychological factors here, being used to transitioning to a life where I'm more tactile and I'm using my touch. It's very interesting, isn't it, that touch is the first sense that develops in the womb, and very rarely do we hear of people that their touch is affected. It's almost nature's way of saying it's the most important of all the senses, and yet one that we don't always use. We rely very heavily on our hearing and vision. And so moving into that world means people may need a lot of support. Think about your own practice. What communication skills do you use now? And you'll use an array of communication skills, but how might they need to be adapted when you're working with deafblind people? How may you need to make changes? For example, if you're having to break bad news to somebody, might you naturally lower the tone of your voice and the volume of your voice? But is that going to work if the person is deafblind, for example? We know, don't we, from all the training that we've done as social workers on communication, how significant silence can be and how powerful silence can be as a communication tool. Again, perhaps in very sensitive and difficult conversations. But is that going to work with a deafblind person? Or does it leave the deafblind person thinking, are you still there? Are you still listening? What about the body language skills we use to indicate active listening, nodding, smiling, those sorts of things? Is that going to work as an indicator that I'm listening, or will I need to use something else? The occasional touch to reassure the person I'm here and I am listening. We're going to have to adapt our own skills. But also, and I've touched on this already a little bit, thinking about professional boundaries, and when we self-disclose in ways that are unintended. And I want to give an example here. Think yourself of the times that you do home visits to service users. You would know that when you go on a home visit, the issue around self-disclosure, there are certain things you wouldn't disclose about yourself. It would be unprofessional, and in some instances, it would be inappropriate. But you do self-disclose, even unintentionally, simply to service users on a daily basis. The minute the service user opens the door and they see you, you've started to self-disclose. If I think about myself, if I do a visit to a service user, the minute they open the door, straight away, male, beard, I can now start guessing his age, roughly whereabouts he is. They may see the ring on my hand and think, okay, he's married because he's wearing a ring. And they may, always a risk, of course, but they may note from my mannerisms, perhaps, or the way I carry myself, that I'm married to a man. Now, all of those things I've not disclosed, but I have disclosed because the person's picked up on it straight away. Does that mean that when I visit a deafblind person who, because of the deafblindness, doesn't pick up on those visual things and therefore doesn't know about me, does that mean I have a responsibility to tell them in order for it to be parity of information shared with all my service users? Do I have a responsibility to tell the service user things that the hearing sighted service user would know, even though I haven't told them? I'm afraid I don't have an easy answer to that question, but I think it's something for us to ponder on when we think about the way we engage with people and the relationships we form with them professionally. So I hope people are following this so far. It's a lot of information, I appreciate, and thank you for sticking with it so far. So I'm just going to finish on these last few now. I'm conscious of time, so we've got 20 minutes left. So just finish on these last few points. The next thing social workers offer is that legal literacy, and research has shown that a strength of social work, as I've said, particularly in the context of multidisciplinary team working, is that social workers bring legal literacy. So what do we know about the law as it relates to social care and deafblind people? Now, I'm going to focus on adults in England, although in terms of policy guidance, that relates to deafblind children as well. And if you're working with children, of course, remember Section 17 of the Children Act in relation to disabled children are, of course, children in need. And of course, the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act, repealed insofar as it relates to adults because of the Care Act, but not insofar as it relates to children. So what are the provisions of particular relevance to deafblind people that we need to know about if we're working with deafblind people in England? Well, outside of the primary legislation itself, the Care Act, there are three things that we need to be looking at. The Care and Support Assessment Regulations, 2014, in particular paragraph 6. The Care and Support Statutory Guidance, which was issued under the Care Act. 2016, there have been subsequent amendments, of course, to that guidance, and the Care and Support Deafblind Children and Adults Policy Guidance back in 2014. So these are the provisions that speak explicitly about the obligations that local authorities have towards deafblind people in England. Now, it's really important to note that the assessment regulations, they are secondary legislation. They're not simply guidance, they are secondary legislation. They have the full force of the law, the same as the Care Act. The statutory guidance, both the Care and Support Stat guidance and the Care and Support for Deafblind Children and Adults policy guidance, they are what they say they are on the tin. They are statutory guidance. They are not simply guidelines or best practice guidelines. They are statutory guidance issued under the Care Act, and therefore a local authority must follow what is in there unless it has sound legal reason for doing so. Now, deafblind people and deafblindness is mentioned on 25 occasions in the Care and Support guidance, far more than deafness alone, and certainly more than drug and alcohol, for example. And this really is absolute credit to deafblind people and organisations often for deafblind people who campaigned long and hard during the passing of the Care Act to get these provisions in. Now, some of the provisions are specific to deafblind people, whilst others are mainstream provisions but have a particular relevance to deafblind people. So it's really important that you are legally literate and aware of the actions that local authorities are required to take when working with deafblind people. So what do those assessment regulations say? Well, they say an assessment which relates to an individual who is deafblind must be carried out by a person who has specific training and expertise relating to individuals who are deafblind. So again, regulations, so this is secondary legislation, it has the full force of the law, it is a statutory duty, and we can see that in the language of must there. And this is why it was so important, this is why I went on and on and on at the beginning of this presentation about who is deafblind. So for social care purposes, a person is deafblind if the individual has combined sight and hearing impairment, which causes difficulty with communication, access to information and mobility. If you go to see somebody who has hearing and sight impairment such that in combination they have difficulty with those three things, then they are entitled to a specialist assessment. And the local authority can do that either in-house. We know many local authorities across the teaching partnership have been training up social workers to their level 3 qualification, or it may be that the local authority need to commission it externally from a specialist provider. But if you identify somebody as deafblind, then they need to have that specialist assessment. And how do we know if they're deafblind? Well, we use that definition that is found in the guidance, a definition that makes no reference to how they communicate, it makes no reference to clinical measures or registration. It's simply those three things. And we've seen, haven't we, relatively recently, some local authorities get into a little bit of bother when they've not complied with this requirement. So these are all ombudsman complaints that were upheld. South Tyneside, sadly, failed to complete an assessment in line with the Care and Support Statutory Guidance. The person wasn't suitably qualified to assess a deafblind person. Kent this year got in bother. The sensory worker went out to see the person, the service user, who's known as Mr. F, and noted that this Mr. F may be deafblind, but the council never actually made a decision as to whether he met that criteria and therefore was entitled to an assessment. And so part of the outcome there was to decide whether he was deafblind, and if he was, to ensure he had a specialist assessment. Now, one of the questions I often get asked, and we'll see, what the guidance says is that the minimum qualification for somebody to do this is level 3, but those with higher and more complex needs necessitate somebody that is qualified beyond level 3. And I'm often asked when I do these sessions, who is that? When is more than level 3 required? And unfortunately, the law doesn't really say when more is required. Now, Sense have developed some guidelines, and they certainly suggest somebody that's congenitally deafblind needs to be assessed by somebody with a qualification higher than level 3. They would also suggest those with acquired deafblindness with additional needs, or acquired deafblindness needing to develop new communication methods or psychological difficulties should be higher. I would also suggest that somebody that's traumatically deafblind should have somebody with a higher qualification than level 3. And so when this ombudsman complaint came in, we thought this would offer some clarity. It didn't really. The council failed to organise specialist assessment of needs by a worker qualified to level 5. However, this was because the court ordered there were childcare proceedings in relation to the service users' children, and it was during those proceedings that the court ordered that the assessment of the parent should be done by someone with level 5 in deafblindness, and that level 3 wasn't enough, and the council didn't organise that. And so what the ombudsman said is, prior to this court order, they felt level 3 was sufficient, and the complaint really was that it was the court that ordered it, and therefore they should have followed through. So it hasn't really given us much more guidance on that, unfortunately. But I've put this quote at the end here because I think this is interesting. This was an email I received from somebody after I'd done one of these sessions from a local authority. You'll be pleased to see none of these local authorities are in our teaching partnership, of course. And she reported all managers commissioners have still not quite fully grasped their duties under the Care Act adequately. They appear to discuss a grey area between dual sensory loss and fully defined deafblindness. And I thought this was a little bit odd. And when I discussed it with her further, what she was getting was management in this case was saying, well, you're not entitled to a specialist. Well, they're not really deafblind. It's just an older person with some sight and hearing, the sort of dual sensory loss. So they're not really entitled to one of those assessments. Or, well, they're not using sign language, or that they're not doing this sort of tactile, that they're not really deafblind. And of course, you all know now that this is a completely false distinction, because the regulations say, and I'll say it again, a person is deafblind if they have combined sight and hearing impairment, which causes difficulties with communication, access to information and mobility. That's it. There is no reference to they have to be registered, or their sight loss and hearing loss have to be at this level, or they have to be sign language users. It doesn't say anything like that whatsoever. There's a very false distinction. If the person has combined sight and hearing loss causing difficulty with those 3 things, then for social care purposes, they are deafblind, and the assessment must be carried out by somebody who's qualified to do so. What we find in the statutory guidance is a little bit more information. It does set out the appropriate level of training, as I've said, stating that those with higher and complex needs, level 3 wouldn't be sufficient. It outlines the minimum areas of training and expertise. It suggests that even if you're going as a qualified worker, you may still need to go with an interpreter where appropriate. Where there has been a specialist involved in assessment, ideally that same specialist, or at least a specialist, should be involved in care and support planning. So move beyond assessment and be involved in care and support planning. And if that proposed care plan is going off to a maximising a funding panel. We're not allowed to call them that because they know that that would recognise the legally dubious, but we all kind of know that's what they are. But if it's going off to be signed off, then that specialist or somebody with specialist knowledge in deafblindness needs to be involved in sign-off. What we also know from the Care and Support Statutory Guidance is that resource allocation systems may be inappropriate when determining the amount of personal budget available for a deafblind person, and that other mechanisms should be considered, often because the RAS comes out with an amount that's far too low to meet the specialist needs of a deafblind person. And I've added there some of the information about fluctuating needs. Now, this is a mainstream provision. It's not specific to deafblind people. But again, we've seen that deafblind people's needs fluctuate considerably, and we need to be thinking about current needs and future needs. And again, with deafblindness, whilst we might be thinking about changes in hearing and vision, we're also thinking about environment. And so the work I did with people with Usher syndrome, for example, the sight loss condition is retinitis pigmentosa, and this affects night vision. And so it's the environment that will result in fluctuating needs. The person is likely to need far more support in the winter, when by 4 o'clock it's already dark, than they do in the summer, for example. And so these are the things that need to be considered as part of assessment. Again, I think one of the absolute advantages of the CARE Act is clarity in relation to eligibility criteria. Often deafblind people have fallen foul of eligibility criteria that has focused on personal care, because many deafblind people do not need assistance with their personal care, but rather with other elements of their lives. And what the care and support eligibility criteria has done, and you will be familiar with these outcomes, I have no doubt, is that it recognises that there's no hierarchy in relation to these criteria, that personal hygiene and personal care is no more important than managing or achieving outcomes across these. So using your home safely, maintaining your nutrition, social elements, so family and personal relationships, and making use of the community, accessing education and training. All of these are equally important. There's no hierarchy, and deafblind people may certainly have difficulties achieving or be unable to achieve a number of these. For example, managing and maintaining your nutrition. Is the deaf person able to access shops and prepare food? Can they identify food and read sell-by dates on, or would they need support with that, for example? Being appropriately clothed. Is the person able to identify the clothing, knowing that the top matches with the bottom, that the socks are appropriately paired? Is the clothing dirty? Have I stained something? Do I need somebody to point these things out to me, for example? Am I able to use my kitchen safely? Am I able to answer the front door safely? And are there concerns around trips and falls at the home? So we can see where that one comes. Am I able to keep my home clean? This can be problematic, can't it, for people with dual sensory impairment? Are they able to observe deterioration of the home, the windows clean, etc., etc.? And can I access information about my utility bills, for example? Developing relationships, very difficult when mobility is problematic and when communication is difficult. So I might need some support or be unable to achieve in relation to that. And remember, you will be familiar with this, for legal purposes, part of your assessment, unable to achieve doesn't mean I'm unable to achieve it without assistance. It also means I'm unable to achieve it with assistance, but doing without assistance, I'm able to, but doing so would cause me significant pain, distress, or anxiety. I can manage to get to the shop on my own, but because of my increasing dual sensory loss, it makes me incredibly anxious to do that. Or I am able to achieve it without assistance, but it would endanger my health and safety or that of others. Or I'm able to achieve it without assistance, but doing so takes me significantly longer. And so I think we can see the ways in which deafblind people are more likely to meet this criteria. And I'll whiz through these. I'm not going to talk about all these because they're not deafblind specific, but it's just that reminder to everybody. And we've seen this in these ombudsman complaints, that there's no hierarchy of needs or well-being, that it's inaccurate to tell people that shopping and cleaning are non-care related. It's inaccurate to tell people that they should use their disability benefits to pay for things like shopping and housework, and therefore they're not eligible for support. There is absolutely nothing in the law that allows a local authority to tell people that they must use their benefits in that way. And we've seen some more recently here, the Hertfordshire County Council, where they were saying that the person really should use their money to buy these things in because they're not really care related, or always asking people to fund housework themselves, or telling people, oh, we don't do that, we don't do housework, we don't do shopping, these sorts of things. The unlawfulness of that approach was made clear again in the North Yorkshire County Council. And this is very important, I think, in a world of three conversations models where we're encouraged to ask people to look at existing strengths or things out in the community that can help them. And this is where Hertfordshire really came a cropper here, that they were saying, well, you've got a private cleaner and therefore that's already there in place, so you're not eligible for housework. Well, that's not legally literate practice. You and I know that when it comes to determining whether somebody's eligible or not, we must ignore anything like that. So we ignore the private cleaner for the purposes of determining whether the person is unable to manage their housework. And so there have been warnings from legal commentators to those that are really embracing things like the three conversations model to think very clearly and carefully about the legal literacy of their staff, and whether people are reminded that their entitlement to assessment is simply on the basis of the appearance of need. And again, we see reference to this. Again, this was a single sensory impaired woman. This was a visually impaired woman. And London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham came a cropper and the complaint was upheld. The woman, so although single sensory impaired, I think it has relevance for our purposes. This lady, because of her visual impairment, she had difficulty sorting out her clothes so that she didn't wear stained or inappropriate clothes. And she needed help to check the content of her fridge, reading cooking instructions, and having somebody to escort her on shopping trips. The council told her, no, the Care Act doesn't require your clothes to match or to be clean, simply that you can get dressed, and you should make use of long life foods and your freezer and ready meals. And the Ombudsman said, no, Hammersmith, that's not correct. That's maladministration because you failed to focus on two elements of well-being, and your assessment must consider the impact of her needs on her well-being. And the two that they picked up on there were dignity and health. How are you maintaining this and promoting this woman's personal dignity if you're suggesting that she could wear dirty clothes or clothes that do not match? Dignity, the importance of personal dignity, essential to that is wearing clean, presentable and appropriate clothes. And her health, how are you, fresh food is essential to meeting her nutritional needs, and the consumption of out-of-date food would carry a significant health risk. So the complaint was upheld in those instances. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to start bringing it to a close now, but do have a look specifically at the Care and Support for Deafblind Children and Adults policy guidance. These are all freely available online. This spells out the specific duties owed to deafblind children and adults, keeping a record of deafblind people in your area and making contact with them, ensuring the assessments done by people who are appropriately qualified, and ensuring that services are appropriate. And here it particularly points out that single sensory impairment services may not be suitable for dual sensory impaired deafblind people. Ensuring that deafblind people have access to specially trained one-to-one workers where they're assessed as needing one, ensuring that information both directly to individual service users but also the population as a whole is accessible, and somebody at director level or a member of the local authority senior team should have overall responsibility for deafblind people. You may wish to locate who that person is in your local authority. And lastly, what can social work offer? It's creative and it's mixed support. And one of the things I loved about working in this field is perhaps I'm a little bit old school, but I got to do what I considered real social work, transcending simply assessment and care management and doing direct work with people. There were rarely off the peg solutions, so we were having to be creative, working with others to think, how do we help this person manage? They can't see a flashing doorbell. They can't hear the really loud one. So I'm going to work with the technical officer and the electrician and wire up their doorbell to a fan and put it next to their chair so that when the doorbell goes, they feel the waft of the fan That's how they're going to know someone's at the door. We don't want a key safe in. You're taking away the woman's independence. She just needs to know someone's there. So thinking about creatively how we're going to do it, using fridge magnets, the letter ones on a tray, and somebody feels those letters to communicate. Thinking about how are we going to work through. And this is what I loved about that work. Using a range of technologies, both mainstream and specialist, we need to think about increased rates of personal budget and direct payment. If the local authority couldn't commission specialist support at that rate, you can't expect the service user to. And so I was often making arguments for an increase in the standard hourly rate in order for the person to secure the service that they required. And I said very early on as well about avoiding low expectations. And there's another rather sad story here from a deafblind person's experience with social services. And this is what she reports. When I was 18 and about to take myself off to the US to go to a university, the local authority sent someone to assess my social care needs. The social worker suggested I might like to go to a day centre where I could do nice activities like craft and use a sensory room. The idea that someone born deafblind was about to go to university seemed beyond her comprehension. My refusal to comply with the social worker's recommendation has now set the tone for contact with the local authority ever since. I am now labelled as difficult, non-compliant, and they haven't agreed to any suitable social care. And I think that really stems from the low expectation of the potentiality of deafblind people. And lastly, while you may have to argue for increased amounts in direct payment, particularly when people cannot benefit from group level services but require one-to-one services, and that is costly. But on the other side, sometimes there are some very simple and effective interventions. Revisiting people's hearing aids and when did they last have a test and why are they in the drawer over there and never worn? We need to do some work around this. The amount of times I've made a big difference by cleaning someone's glasses, it really makes a huge difference. Speaking to the care home saying, probably putting white mashed potato and white fish on a white place, on a white mat, on a white tablecloth. This is probably why this person's struggling to manage at meal times. Let's just get some colour contrast in there. The bog standard occupational therapy white grab rail on the white tiles in the white bathroom. We need to think differently here. How is that person going to be able to see that? We need to get some colour contrast going. These are relatively simple interventions. So the slides can be made available for people, so I'm not going to read these out because I am conscious of time, but we will want to work with a range of people, colleagues in health, education, communication professionals, specialists within social services, support staff, and of course specialist organisations. And I've listed a few of those organisations, the national ones, Sense and Deafblind UK, but also more local organisations or organisations such as Usher UK and Usher Kids focused on particular conditions. So what are our future research and practice priorities? I think a lot more work needs to be done on older deafblind people, particularly those ageing with the impairment. Increase use and the development of tools to help us identify deafblindness amongst people with learning difficulties, amongst older people. There's increasing amounts of work being done on assistive technology and their role in supporting deafblind people. We've recently seen a study on, I'm sure most of you are more IT savvy than me, but you know, these 3D printers that you can now get. There's been some work about how a 3D printer can be used to support deafblind people with certain activities. We need a very integrated interdisciplinary approach, and I'm advocating very strongly for social work's voice to be heard within that interdisciplinary approach. And one problem that has eluded researchers is establishing the breaking point. At what point does one impairment become significant such that they're no longer able to compensate? That idea of synergy that I talked about at the beginning. So there's some further reading here that you may be interested in, some work that I've done on COVID and deafblindness, and with colleagues, BASWA published our argument really as to why we think deafblindness is core social work, and also the World Federation report I wrote about, and some work I've done with my colleague Walter Witter at the University of Montreal around the experiences of older people. Some of the organisations I mentioned there, Deafblind International, I hope the Teaching Partnership will forgive me that I'm going to shamelessly plug now. Deafblind International has 15 international networks, and one of those networks is the Acquired Deafblindness Network, for which I am the chair. So if you do wish to become a member, do drop me an email. It's free to join. We currently have 171 members worldwide who are either have acquired deafblindness themselves, they are social workers or practitioners working with people with acquired deafblindness, or they're researchers, and we're a worldwide network sort of sharing ideas, best practice and information. So do drop me an email if you wish to join that network. If you're interested in user perspectives and blogs, I've listed a few there. That's it for me, looking a little bit younger in that photo. I've aged since then, but I'll stick to that photo for now. My details are on there, including my email and Twitter. So thank you for staying with me, not too over time, which is quite good for me. A lot of information. I hope it has been of interest. And thanks again to the Teaching Partnership for inviting me to speak.
Thank you, Peter. That was a really, really interesting session. It's definitely given me lots to think about and reflect on. Particularly, I mean, I come from a background of working with adults, and particularly older adults with memory impairment or diagnosed dementia, and it's made me reflect a lot really on the sort of specific challenges that group of people would be facing, really, that maybe hadn't given as much thought to before. So, and hopefully other people have found it useful too. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah.
Just to everybody here, I know that my colleague Adam's put the link to feedback in the chat. So if people could give some feedback, both for Peter himself and for the partnership, just so we can to help us with planning future CPD, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sarah. Did you want me to pick up any questions now, or do we need to bring the session to a close?
If anybody's got any questions, then if did you want to put them in the chat, and Peter will be happy to answer them now. I can't. People are making some really nice comments on the chat. That it was a really insightful session and very thought provoking.
Thank you very much.
I'm just checking to see if there are any questions. Can't see any at the moment.
There was one about assessment, but a colleague kindly has answered that. Pauline has answered around qualification. What I would add, in addition to qualifications in deafblindness, of course, the person needs to be qualified and experienced in assessment. And so social workers are, ideally placed for that. So to complete a specialist deafblind assessment, you need the qualification in deafblindness, but you need the experience in assessment, which of course social workers, social care practitioners, OTs have that already.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I can't see any further sessions at the moment, so I think we can close. But yes, thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for inviting me. And Adam has done all the background work. So thanks to Adam, and thanks to Sarah for hosting.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Pete. Thanks, Pete.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much.
I think you were my lecturer. Are you the one at the Staffordshire University?
I did used to be at Staffordshire University.
Yeah,
yes.
You taught me social work.
Oh, did I?
Yeah, you were my tutor, in fact.
Who's speaking? I can't see.
It's Linus.
I remember you, Linus.
Yes.
Nice. It's lovely to see you.
Where are you now?
I'm at Birmingham City University.
Ah, excellent.
Yeah. Well, it's lovely to see you, Linus.
Yeah. I'm now with University of Wolverhampton.
Fantastic.
Yeah, so you did a good job. You've taken me this far.
Oh, well, I'm very pleased to hear it.
That's lovely feedback, Peter.
That's very kind to hear. It's lovely to see you, Linus. You take care.
Bye.
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 Bye.